reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. President Ford stepped up his attacks today on Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan stepped up his attacks on President Ford. And Jimmy Carter campaigned serenely, confident of picking up even more delegates tomorrow. There will be presidential primaries tomorrow in Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, and the District of Columbia. And for Gerald Ford, who suffered a devastating defeat in Saturday's Texas primary, the Indiana contest took on added importance. A Reagan victory there could change the nature of the Republican campaign even more than the Texas results changed it. Here are reports on the Ford and Reagan campaigns today.
Reagan began stressing a new campaign theme today, his argument that he, not President Ford, would be the strongest candidate to run against Jimmy Carter in November. Reagan said Mr. Ford, as a member of the Washington establishment, would have to defend the largest budget deficit in history, what Reagan calls the decline in U.S. defense strength, and the inefficient and unresponsive federal bureaucracy. Although he did not bring up the subject, Reagan agreed that Mr. Ford would also be vulnerable to attack on the subject of Watergate, whereas he would not.
I'm saying that I believe that I have a better chance of opposing Mr. Carter when it comes down to whatever specifics he's mentioned so far, and they have not been too many. He reveals that he, too, is more opposed to who is in Washington than what is being done in Washington, because most of his solutions involve the federal government in additional federal programs, such as national health insurance and so forth.
Ken Lay Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
The president says he's not been forced into a new campaign strategy because of the Texas disaster, but he is showing a new aggressiveness. He said Reagan makes rash decisions, and he told state and local officials that Reagan opposes a program dear to their hearts, revenue sharing.
He has stated his opposition categorically to revenue sharing on the grounds that it's simply another federal program piled on top of all of the others, a view which is totally contrary to the facts.
At a news conference, Mr. Ford stuck to his get-tough tactics and said Reagan should disclose all of his tax returns.
As far as I know, Governor Reagan has not made public any of his 1975 income tax payments. He has not disclosed it to the press or to the public, and I suggest respectfully that he do the same on this disclosure as we're doing as far as paying the government for this particular trip, which is total.
The president blames his thrashing in Texas on crossover votes from Democrats. Here in Indiana, as in Texas, Democrats can legally vote in the Republican primary, but if they do, they lose their chance to vote for Democratic candidates in hotly contested state races. So they may decide not to cross over. And that would be just fine with the president. John Cochran, NBC News, with the Ford campaign in Indianapolis.
So, a lot rides on Indiana. We asked Judy Woodruff of our staff to have a look at the state and at its politics. Here is her report.
Indiana is much of what is traditional in the American Middle West. What dominates here are small towns and small cities, communities that help nourish the conservative ideas most Hoosiers cling to.
We think that we've got too much government, and Hoosiers would like to do away with it. We believe in the rule that for every law Congress passed, they ought to repeal two.
Even the largest metropolitan area, Indianapolis and its suburbs, unlike many other American cities, remains predominantly white and Protestant. War memorials here occupy positions as prominent as skyscrapers. Most of Indiana, though, is farms. Farms producing corn, soybeans, hogs, and more. Farm prices have recently stabilized here in the home state of Agriculture Secretary Butz, and that may help President Ford. But interwoven primarily through the northern half of Indiana is a great deal of industry. Some of the biggest steel mills in the world, and factories that turn out everything from pharmaceuticals to auto parts. This is also a political organization state. A Republican governor controls thousands of patronage employees who legally kick back 2% of their income to a well-financed party organization. They are officially neutral, but much of their muscle and money is with Ford. This organization helped give Richard Nixon some of his biggest victories and could be a big help to fellow Midwesterner Ford. In addition, hundreds of volunteers are phoning Ford supporters, reminding them to vote Tuesday.
I would like to know if President Ford can count on your vote in this important primary.
Campaign officials are worried that low-key state races will hurt Republican turnout. And they hope that strong party identification will prevent Wallace Democrats from crossing over to vote for Reagan, as they did in Texas. Reagan, starting late and behind, has turned an almost sure loss into a close contest. Now he hopes to bring to Indiana momentum from his Texas landslide. He's spending twice what Ford is for TV and radio advertising and stressing defense in a state with many active veterans. Reagan calls himself the underdog in Indiana, but after Texas, Ford organizers here are plainly worried about the possibility Reagan may pull off his first victory in a northern state. Judy Woodruff, NBC News, Indianapolis.
Poll is out, and it shows Jimmy Carter beating Gerald Ford by a margin of 47% to 43%. That's a considerable improvement for Carter. In the previous Harris poll made in March, Carter trailed the president by 7 points. Now he beats him by 4 points. The latest poll was made nationally before Carter's big victory in the Pennsylvania primary. That victory speeded up the Carter bandwagon. He is expected to do very well tomorrow in the Indiana primary and in the Georgia primary, and even win a few delegates in George Wallace's home state of Alabama. And Carter got some additional good news today in Indiana. Robert Hager has that story.
It was 6:30 in the morning outside the Western Electric plant in Indianapolis. There was Senator Birch Bayh introducing Jimmy Carter.
Come on, Dave. Birch Bayh. Say hi to Governor Carter. He needs your help tomorrow. Give him a hand.
Bayh, who had run against Carter in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, had decided to endorse him now.
Last October, as many of you know, I asked the people of this country to join in my effort to seek the presidency. Despite the able assistance of many very loyal friends, our campaign was short-lived. It's becoming increasingly apparent to me that one candidate has the opportunity to win the nomination through the primary and state convention process and thus avoid the divisiveness and bitterness which results from a brokered convention. In my judgment, that one candidate is Jimmy Carter.
Senator Bayh has influence among labor leaders. That's important to Carter.
We did discuss that briefly last night, and Senator Bayh has excellent relationships with labor, and I think my relationship with labor has been improving. But that would be one of the ways in which Senator Bayh could help me a great deal, yes.
Carter also hopes Bayh's announcement may prod others who were once his rivals for the nomination to offer their support. This fits in with Carter's thinking that he now needs to look beyond the nomination to the general election, and that for that purpose he needs to bring the Democratic Party together. Robert Hager, NBC News in Gary, Indiana.
And David Brinkley reporting from the NBC News Election Center in New York.
Good evening. Voters in 3 states in the District of Columbia were electing delegates today to the presidential nominating conventions. The 4 primaries will produce 177 Democratic delegates and 153 Republican delegates. And in one primary, the Indiana primary, it was showdown time again for Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. 3 days ago in the Texas primary, Reagan wiped out the president in a stunning victory. In today's primaries, Reagan is considered the favorite in Georgia and Alabama, and Indiana looks very close. Ford says his Indiana chances are very, very good. Reagan says he is closing the gap, and he was campaigning in West Virginia. Kenley Jones reports.
Reagan spent the day campaigning along the country roads of West Virginia. The primary for the 28 delegates here will be held next Tuesday. But unlike the 3 states where primaries are being held today, voters will not be allowed to cross party lines. Reagan is counting heavily on Democratic crossovers in Georgia, Alabama, and Indiana today to help push him past President Ford in the number of delegates committed to each man. In discussing the Panama Canal today, Reagan said for the first time he would risk guerrilla war rather than negotiate the return of the canal to Panama.
is this to be United States policy? That any time a dictator of a small country threatens us with some kind of disturbance, we back down and give him whatever he asks for. And I just don't believe we should. That canal zone is sovereign territory, the same as is the state of Alaska.
That kind of tough talk about the canal worked in Reagan's favor in Texas and is expected to help him win in Georgia and Alabama today. Still in question is how well he will do in Indiana. Reagan and his advisors are extremely interested in the outcome there, where his polls show he has been closing the gap on Mr. Ford. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Charleston, West Virginia.
At the same time, another prominent conservative spoke out today on the Panama Canal and on what Reagan's been saying about it. Barry Goldwater has been critical in the past of Reagan's stand on the canal, and today at a press conference, Goldwater used his strongest language so far. He said Reagan's position on the canal either shows a misunderstanding of the facts or, in Goldwater's words, a surprisingly dangerous state of mind. Here is more of what Goldwater said.
I know that Ronald Reagan's public statement concerning the Panama Canal contained gross factual errors. I also know his statements on the Panama issue could needlessly lead this country into open military conflict. I must assume that Ron's attacks are the result of a lack of understanding of the facts involving the Panama Canal. Either that, or else they reflect a surprisingly dangerous state of mind, which is that he will not seek alternatives to a military solution when dealing with complex foreign policy issues. I believe he has a solemn responsibility, if he expects to be taken seriously as a candidate for the Republican nomination, to state specifically what his position is concerning the canal.
In your opinion, preclude Mr. Reagan from holding the office of the presidency?
No, I don't think so. I think he ought to be more careful to whom he listens. Knowing Ronnie the way I do, I am sure that somebody has told him this would make a good attack on the president.
There was also a suggestion from the White House today that some of the techniques used to finance the Reagan campaign should be investigated. David?
White House spokesman Ron Nessen suggested today that the campaign money being spent for Ronald Reagan be looked into, investigated. Outside groups, he said, have been buying as much as 80% of the political advertising for Reagan, and he said this deserves some attention. As he put it, given the new morality and the higher expectations in the wake of Watergate. Well, Reagan responded, a diversionary tactic born of desperation and possibly a touch of hysteria. He said there's nothing to it and he can investigate all he wants. And the president is about to veto a bill giving Congress more say on foreign military aid, who gets it and how much. He objects to several parts of the military aid bill. Veto a bill giving Congress more say on foreign military aid, who gets it and how much. He objects to several parts of the military aid bill, including a part that gives Congress the right to cancel arms sales above $7 billion. As the law now stands, Congress can only act on sales of $25 million or more. This comes too late to help, if it does help, the president in today's Indiana primary, where he has a stiff challenge from Reagan. Last week, Ford predicted he would win Indiana. Today, he only said he expects to do well. He has now cast himself firmly in the role of underdog, challenged and caught in a serious fight. It was not long ago, in the flush of victory after Florida, that the president was asked about Reagan entering future primaries, and he said, I don't care whether he enters or not. John?
We'll have coverage of the Democrats running today and other news in a minute. Alabama, Georgia, and District of Columbia primaries. Authorities in Indiana said the vote there was about average. Jimmy Carter is on the ballot in all states, with delegates supporting him on the Alabama ballot. He's expected to do well everywhere but Alabama, and he could pick up some delegates there in George Wallace's home state. Carter went home to Georgia today, and with him went our man, Robert Hager.
Carter flew home to Plains, Georgia today, exuberant but worn out.
I'm tired. I've been campaigning now for the last month or two without any time off.
There hadn't been much chance for Carter to reflect on his sudden emergence as the clear favorite for the nomination.
It took me a day or two after the Pennsylvania primary to realize what had happened in the strategic thrust of the campaign, with a natural combative attitude, eager to go to the next primary, looking for strong opponents, constantly analyzing problems in the campaign itself, to realize after Pennsylvania that a lot of those problems have been ended permanently, and to change our thrust toward a more consolidative type effort to bring the different elements in the party together and to start accumulating delegates is something that's been a little bit difficult for us this week, but of course that's a nice thing when you have to make that kind of change. Those people
now Carter was headed home.
Those people who convince their local congressman that, well, it's just like a vacation for me, even if I spend one day in Plains, to see my own family and my little girl and my wife. For all reasons, I'm looking forward to being home.
Carter voted in Plains in the Georgia primary. Then he went home to await what he expects will be news of primary victories in Indiana and Georgia and a strong showing against George Wallace in Alabama. Robert Hager, NBC News, Plains, Georgia.
There's been another and perhaps surprising result in the primaries this year, and that is the sagging of George Wallace's ability to get votes. Even in Alabama, his own state, he has felt it necessary to campaign hard and to spend a lot of his dwindling money. A report from George Lewis in Montgomery.
George Wallace has found he can no longer take the Alabama voters for granted. He stepped up his campaign here after some of Jimmy Carter's organizers predicted Wallace would lose. Reportedly, Wallace has about $160,000 in remaining campaign funds and has spent more than half of that in Alabama. Carter is not Wallace's only worry. Democrats here are permitted to cross over and vote in the Republican primary. A heavy crossover vote for Ronald Reagan, similar to what happened in Texas, could hand Wallace a loss. In his speeches, Wallace no longer talks about winning the nomination. At a rally yesterday, he talked instead about giving Alabama a voice at the Democratic National Convention.
Years past, I'm still a candidate, and I recognize the obstacles in my path in the year 1976. So are the obstacles in the path of everyone else. But by George Wallace going, who's representing a movement that you started, you're going to get a better candidate, and you're going to get a better platform, because we're going to be there, and you know what I'm telling you is the truth.
At noon today, Wallace went back to his hometown of Clayton, Alabama, to vote. Clayton is a small town, population 1,800, and a lot of people here are his personal friends. Some of them talked wistfully about the days when George Wallace was able to walk around shaking hands. The candidate in the wheelchair. Perhaps that image has hurt Wallace more than competition from Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter. It is something he cannot escape, even in the privacy of a voting booth. George Lewis, NBC News, Clayton, Alabama.
In past primaries, other candidates were reluctant to challenge Wallace in any state where he was strong, and this year he is challenged in his own state, and strongly. The weather in Alabama was good today, and the voter turnout was called moderate. John?
We'll have more political news later in the program, and we'll have other news in a minute.
With John Chancellor reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. The score in delegates to the Republican Presidential Convention stood today at Ronald Reagan, 366 delegates, Gerald Ford, 293. Following his close win in yesterday's Indiana primary and his runaway victories in Georgia and Alabama, Reagan is ahead in actual pledged delegates for the first time. And at the White House, there was talk of campaigning differently and making other changes. Tom Brokaw reports.
President Ford said he was disappointed with yesterday's results, but emphasized he still expects to win nomination and the election. He said there will be a reassessment on a number of issues, not just foreign policy and Henry Kissinger.
We're in the process of analyzing the total picture, not just one issue. I can't give you any immediate assessment as to what issue or whether all of the issues had a contributing factor, but I certainly wouldn't say that the result in Indiana or the other two states can be attributed to foreign policy alone. I'm sure it was a combination of many, many things.
The president was asked if Henry Kissinger's future would be in doubt if the analysis showed the Secretary of State were an issue in the campaign.
Not at all. Not at all.
Senator Robert Griffin and other friends of the president hope the Indiana results will encourage other Republican office holders to come to Mr. Ford's assistance.
I think that a lot of the president's supporters are going to be galvanized and inspired now to go out and work harder. I think that people don't want in November a choice between Mr. Reagan and Mr. Carter.
The fact is, no one is sure just what the president should do to slow the Reagan momentum. The president said today that it's up to his campaign organization to come up with a plan, but his national chairman, Rogers Morton, spent most of the day running between his office and the White House. There are two major problems for the Ford campaign: Reagan's increasingly effective attacks on administration foreign policy, and what the Ford campaign officials say is a heavy crossover vote, Democrats crossing over to vote for Ronald Reagan. White House spokesman insisted today that the president would not conduct foreign policy with one eye on the ballot box. So most of the changes are expected to come in campaign techniques. Just what those changes will be still has not been decided. But the Ford campaign recognizes it has a major problem, a problem that will grow even larger if it doesn't act quickly to slow the Reagan drive. Tom Brokaw, NBC News at the White House.
As Tom Brokaw reported, the White House seems to be worried that former Democratic Wallace voters defeated Mr. Ford in Indiana by voting in the Republican primary for Ronald Reagan. We polled 2,500 voters in Indiana yesterday, and our figures don't show that kind of crossover. A small percentage of Democrats voted in the Republican primary yesterday, but from what we can tell, Ford was not beaten by former Wallace Democrats who voted for Reagan. And here's how it came out. In Indiana, Reagan 51%, Ford 49%, a narrow but extremely important victory for Reagan. Reagan won 4 primaries in 4 days, beginning with Texas last Saturday. He's got 366 delegates to Gerald Ford's 293. However, many, if not most, of the 314 uncommitted delegates are for Ford and not for Reagan. Nevertheless, there was a special sweetness for Reagan in the Indiana primary. Kenley Jones has that story.
Reagan was hungry for a win in a state north of the Mason-Dixon line to break away from the role of regional candidate. In Indiana, although the margin of victory was slim, he got his fill. He was greeted by enthusiastic crowds campaigning there last weekend. It was obvious he was closing the gap from President Ford's lead. Reagan was campaigning in Nebraska last night when the first returns began to come in. He was told by a cheering crowd of supporters that he was leading in Indiana.
I'm not going to cheer until they count those votes. Call it superstition if you will, but I've just got my fingers crossed and I'm hanging on.
By this morning, it was clear that Reagan had scored an upset in Indiana as well as winning Georgia and Alabama, and he began the day campaigning for the first time as the front runner. Reagan said he is convinced now that he can win the nomination, despite criticism that he is too conservative and too divisive to win the election in November.
In states where people can cross over, Democrats and independents are choosing to vote for me. Now, that doesn't seem, they can't have it both ways. I can't have both a narrow base and then, on the other hand, have my victories in the primaries deprecated by the fact that Democrats chose to vote for me.
Reagan said he believes uncommitted delegates will hold the balance of power at the convention, and he will start to work now to persuade them to vote for him instead of President Ford. But he said he will make no major changes in his campaign. He believes he has momentum going for him now in the remaining primaries. And the best way to bring uncommitted delegates to his side is to keep winning. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Nebraska.
Also in the news today, big smiles from Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Carter. We'll have that story from Atlanta. Jimmy Carter had a good day yesterday, easily winning the Indiana Democratic primary, winning by a huge margin in his home state of Georgia, and winning the delegate contest in the District of Columbia. Carter did lose to George Wallace in Wallace's home state of Alabama, but that didn't lessen the optimism in the Carter camp today. His people said again that he'll have 2/3 of the delegates necessary for the presidential nomination by the second week of June. Robert Hager of our staff is with the Carter campaign.
It was another victory party for Carter last night. After months of campaigning, everything seemed to be going his way.
I remember when I announced for president,
in December of 1974, there was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said Jimmy Carter is running for what? And the what was about this big.
Carter's also watching the Republican battle now. He'd rather run against Reagan. Carter thinks President Ford is in trouble after Indiana.
I think this is a very severe blow to Ford. I think this is going to put Ford on the defensive. It's obvious that Indiana was where Ford should have done well. Nobody thought that Ford could beat Reagan in Georgia or Alabama. So I think he's in trouble.
While the Republicans fight it out, Carter's 31-year-old campaign manager, Hamilton Jordan, told reporters he hears enough to believe the Democrats are coming together.
We do a lot of things that you don't hear. I'm not going to tell. I can't tell you about them right now. I think you'll see individual delegates moving to our campaign. I think you'll see leaders who have influence over blocks of delegates possibly moving to our campaign.
Along this line, Carter talked by telephone yesterday with Senator Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey has not endorsed Carter. Carter said Humphrey did say he wanted harmony within the Democratic Party this fall, and the two men agreed to meet privately within a few weeks. Robert Hager, NBC News, Atlanta.
Another indication of how things are going for Carter came last night when George Wallace said, "I could support him." And Congressman Mo Udall, who is still an active candidate, said today he could support Carter. Udall talked of unity. He said the Democrats are, in his words, not going to screw it up the way we did in 68 and 72. Udall said we're going to win one for a change. NBC News now gives Carter 554 delegates. Scoop Jackson, not an active candidate, 195. Udall, 178 delegates. George Wallace, 153, and 252 are uncommitted. Ballot. Reagan said this in the aftermath of his series of victories over President Ford in state conventions and primary states, which has put him ahead of Gerald Ford in terms of committed delegates. Reagan's prediction came in Louisiana. With him was our reporter, Kenley Jones.
Reagan has said all along that he believed neither he nor President Ford could get enough delegates to win the nomination on the first ballot. He was saying that yesterday in Nebraska. But today in Louisiana, he said he has changed his mind. Delegate selection will begin in Louisiana next Saturday at district conventions. The 41 delegates who are to be chosen here are technically uncommitted, but Reagan believes about 30 of them favor him, and he wants them to go on record and say so.
I have to tell you now, in view of the last few days, they have so far exceeded our projections that I would like to see the Louisiana delegation pledged, not uncommitted, because I believe it is possible to go to the convention now with enough delegates to win on the first ballot.
Reagan was asked to explain why he believes a first ballot victory is now possible.
We have leaped far ahead. I never expected a clean sweep of 100 delegates in Texas. I never expected the margin of victory that we had in the three primaries of last Tuesday. And very frankly now, I believe that we can. That the uncommitted delegates, and many of them, there's no sense in waiting till convention time.
Reagan could offer no hard evidence that uncommitted delegations already chosen may now be ready to back him. His decision to talk about a first ballot victory was based more on the momentum his campaign has going now than on a delegate count. It also has the effect of creating the impression that a Reagan bandwagon is rolling and that uncommitted delegates had better get on board before they get left behind. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Louisiana.
Senator Robert Griffin, Republican of Michigan, said Ford's actions today and some of his political plans.
President Ford began the public part of his day with a meeting to discuss his proposal to finance Social Security. Congress has not yet acted on it, and of course, Social Security was an issue that worked well for the president against Ronald Reagan in early primaries. In coming days, Mr. Ford is expected to spend more time talking about his domestic and economic programs. Presidential advisors hope that Senator Barry Goldwater, among others, will take on Reagan in the defense area. NBC News has learned that Commerce Undersecretary James Baker will go over to the President Ford campaign to attract a new drive for uncommitted Republican voters. The president's campaign strategists hope that will offset the effect of conservative Democrats crossing over to vote for Ronald Reagan. Also, at the same time, the Ford Campaign Committee is cutting down on its paid staff. President Ford could release more money, in effect, to all campaigns by signing the new federal election law, which arrived at the White House last night. But he's not expected to act on it until sometime next week. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the White House.
Political activity today. Scoop Jackson, who withdrew as an active candidate in the primaries, was trying for more convention delegates in Connecticut. Congressman Mo Udall was concentrating on the Michigan primary, and Jimmy Carter got some good news. Carter was endorsed today by Leonard Woodcock of the United Auto Workers Union, a boon of some value in the Michigan primary. Carter was in Maryland and in Michigan today, and he was there for Woodcock's statement. Robert Hager reports.
Woodcock was waiting when Carter flew into Detroit to campaign for Michigan's May 18th primary. In a state where Congressman Morris Udall has been making a major effort, Woodcock's support will be important for Carter.
I endorse Governor Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. It is time to end the Civil War and bring this country together into one nation. There could be no better symbol of reconciliation than to elect a president from the genuine South, the new South, one who listens to the people instead of the traditional politicians.
Earlier today, Carter campaigned in Maryland, where he faces stiff competition from California's Governor Edmund Jerry Brown. Carter says he has polls showing that Brown is slightly ahead in Maryland right now. And Carter accuses many of the state's most influential Democrats of banding together behind Brown in order to stop Carter.
Jerry Brown is not running for president. He does not have a single delegate qualified in Maryland. He's been adopted by the political bosses and the machine politicians of this state who only want to see a deadlocked or a broken convention. Don't let yourselves be misled by the attractiveness of Governor Brown. The struggle is between the people choosing the president and having the president obligated only to you, or the political bosses choosing the president and having the president obligated to the political bosses. Now, this is important. It is a major issue here.
Carter says he could lose Maryland to Governor Brown, but he doesn't think that would seriously damage his chances for a first ballot nomination. Robert Hager, NBC News in Baltimore.
And here's where the candidates stand on delegates to the national conventions. Jimmy Carter has 551, the largest grouping. The next largest grouping is the uncommitted delegates, 251 of them. Scoop Jackson has 198, Mo Udall has 180, George Wallace has 146. In all, more than half of all the Democratic delegates have been chosen so far. And on the Republican side, we have these figures. Ronald Reagan has 366, Gerald Ford has 293, and there are 314 uncommitted Republican delegates. Some important presidential politics tomorrow in the West Virginia and Nebraska primaries. The main contest is in Nebraska, where Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan will be at it again. If Reagan should beat the president again, as he did in Texas and Indiana, that will hurt the Ford campaign seriously. One reason for Reagan's successes is that he's been saying the United States is second militarily to the Soviet Union. The president says we are not second. And Mr. Ford returned to that theme at the Washington Monument today in a speech honoring Armed Services Week. John Cochran was there.
With the president's advisors urging him to emphasize the fact that he is the president, today's ceremony was made to order. And in an unexpected show of candor, his press secretary did not claim that Mr. Ford's speech was non-political. The president promised to provide the armed forces with the finest weapons available.
The weapons we hold today and those we plan for the future give America a mighty power.
Then Mr. Ford examined some models of military hardware, including the controversial B-1 bomber, just one of several expensive weapon systems he wants in production. His aides say he's bewildered that Ronald Reagan has gotten so much political mileage by attacking him on defense. The president got some cheering up when a crowd asked him to come over. There may not be any primary votes in this crowd, but Mr. Ford seemed glad to get in some handshaking anyway.
Late today, Mr. Ford met with his political advisors, but much of his strategy was already set. He will avoid personal attacks on Reagan and will talk more about the nation's economic recovery. He will call in IOUs from congressmen whose active support could be helpful. And with his campaign in financial trouble for the first time, he will limit his travel to states where his personal appearance could be decisive. That's why he canceled plans this week to go to Arkansas and will instead spend an extra 2 days in his home state, Michigan, where defeat could be devastating. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House. As the president and Reagan head for tomorrow's Nebraska primary, here's how they stand in delegates. Ford picked up 17 delegates in state caucuses this weekend. Ronald Reagan picked up 30 delegates. Reagan now has 408 delegates. Ford has 320, and there are 315 uncommitted Republican delegates. On the Democratic side, Jimmy Carter picked up 13 delegates this weekend. Mo Udall got 6, George Wallace 2 more, and California Governor Jerry Brown got his first delegate in Wyoming. Carter now has 564, Jackson has 198, Udall 186, George Wallace 148, and there are 268 uncommitted. In addition to Reagan and Ford in the Republican primary in Nebraska, there are 11 names on the Democratic primary ballot there, but the main Democratic contest is between Jimmy Carter, the front runner, and Senator Frank Church, who is just starting his run in the primaries. The big story in Nebraska, however, is the Republican story and the future of Gerald Ford. Tom Brokaw has been in Nebraska looking at the Republican contest, and here is his report.
Nebraska, a conservative agricultural state President Ford expected to win. But by the time the president returned to his Omaha birthplace last week, his campaign here was in trouble, deep trouble. The issues that defeated him in Texas and Indiana have followed him to Nebraska. Many Nebraska farmers still have not forgiven the president for withholding grain sales to Russia last year, so the Ford campaign asked a Nebraska senator to help out.
This is Senator Roman Ruska. The farmer needs all of the friends he can get in Washington. President Ford is one friend the farmer cannot do without.
Nebraska, headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, is another state where national defense is a big issue. And Ronald Reagan has been continuing his attack on Ford administration policies, repeating his pledge to get rid of Secretary Kissinger.
They don't say anything about saying who you wouldn't appoint, and I wouldn't appoint Henry Kissinger.
To counter Reagan, the Ford campaign brought a familiar voice to Nebraska radio commercials, Senator Barry Goldwater.
I know that Ronald Reagan's public statement concerning the Panama Canal contained gross factual errors. I also know his statements on the Panama issue could needlessly lead this country into open military conflict.
Issues aside, selecting delegates in Nebraska is kind of tricky. President Ford and Ronald Reagan are each represented by more than 100 people on the ballot, but only 25 delegates will be elected. So the two campaigns are working hard to concentrate the vote on only 25 names. Reagan's television commercials promote 25 target delegates, so his vote won't be spread out. Reagan supporters appear to be well ahead of the president's forces in organizing this important part of the campaign.
Take the Reagan target names to the poll and vote to assure a Reagan-committed Nebraska delegation to the Republican National Convention.
President Ford hopes to slow Reagan's momentum in Nebraska. If he doesn't, the Reagan campaign, like the Missouri River, can keep on moving toward Kansas City and the Republican National Convention. Tom Brokaw.
Today, in the House, Robert Hager has the Carter story.
Carter's campaign day illustrated his problems as the Democratic frontrunner. He spent some of this day campaigning for votes, some here on Capitol Hill, seeking support from party office holders, the sort of Democratic regulars he'll need to bind the party together. At a Capitol News conference, he won the support of about 20 freshman congressmen.
I, along with a number of first-term colleagues, are proud today to endorse Jimmy Carter for president, thus saying that the new faces in Congress want to work with the president rather than in the state of hostility that presently exists.
Carter will see other congressmen and senators tonight. Friday, he'll meet with Labor's George Meany. Carter spent the rest of this day dealing with his other major problem, trying to head off Stop Carter movements in the primaries. Carter was here in Maryland, which votes a week from today, and where Carter believes California Governor Edmund Brown, Jr. is ahead. Speaking in Rockville, Carter attacked Brown.
He's depending upon a deadlocked convention, not even hoping that he'll be the nominee. But a vote cast for him is a vote cast away from you toward the machine politicians and political bosses in Maryland to vote at the convention in July, not for the man of your choice, but for their choice.
But Carter feels even if Brown is successful in Maryland or later in Nevada or California, Carter will already have too many delegates assembled to be stopped. Robert Hager, NBC News, Rockville, Maryland.
In New York.
Good evening. There was a new look today in the contest for the Republican presidential nomination. Ronald Reagan has won 5 of the last 6 Republican primaries, and Gerald Ford turned to the next primary in his home state, Michigan. If he can't win there, his own campaign manager said the Republican nomination might have to be decided in a fight on the convention floor. The president today, no surprise, was campaigning in Michigan. With him was our man, Tom Brokaw.
The pressure is on President Ford for next Tuesday's Michigan primary. Michigan will send one of the largest delegations to the Republican National Convention, and it is Mr. Ford's home state. So a loss here next Tuesday would be doubly devastating for the president.
Arriving in Detroit today, the president emphasized his Michigan background, took credit for what he called peace, prosperity, and trust, and campaigned for the crossover vote.
I want every person who's registered in this state who can feel confidence in what we've done to vote for me, whether they call themselves Republicans, Independents, or Democrats.
The entire Michigan Republican congressional delegation came along to make the same point.
There are going to be some, Wallace Democrats perhaps, who are going to cross over to try to vote for Mr. Reagan. But we're convinced that if we get out a big vote, that most of the independents and even some of the Democrats will vote for President Ford, as well as the majority of Republicans.
When the president appeared before the Detroit Economic Club, he tried out the new Ford campaign strategy. Instead of trying to answer Reagan, he blamed Congress.
Those who are critical should focus on the right target, some of the members of the House as well as the Senate. It is not Washington that is the problem, but the wrong people in Washington who are the problem.
President Ford returns to Michigan Friday for a weekend of campaigning for his most important primary since New Hampshire. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Detroit.
We have nearly all the returns in now from yesterday's Republican primaries. In the Nebraska primary, Reagan was the decisive winner with 55% to President Ford's 45%, Reagan's biggest percentage in any primary this year. In West Virginia, Ford was the decisive winner, 57% to Reagan's 43%. No crossover votes allowed, no Democrats voting in the Republican primary in either state. Reagan was on the road today talking about the returns. Here's that story from Kenley Jones.
This morning as he left Boise, Idaho, headed for more campaigning in Kentucky and then Michigan. He had good reason to be. Despite losing the popular vote to President Ford in West Virginia, the delegates there will go to the Republican convention uncommitted. That keeps them out of Mr. Ford's column for now, at least. That loss was overshadowed by Reagan's impressive win in Nebraska. He called it one of his most important victories so far.
I won with what's almost a landslide margin in that Republican state with no crossovers, which I think indicates that there hasn't been some fluke of crossovers or something of that kind as they tried to intimate in the other states.
Governor, you don't deny that crossovers has helped you in Texas and places like that.
I have asked for them. And I will continue to campaign on the basis that I think this is a time to put together a new majority.
Reagan has added a new line to his campaign speech this trip, calling on Republicans to unite now behind him in preparation for the general election in November. And he has begun talking about the kind of running mate he wants for vice president, someone whose political views are compatible with his, not necessarily someone who would balance the ticket geographically. Reagan says he knows a hard fight is still ahead for the Republican nomination, but more and more he is talking like a man who already has it won. Ken Lee Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Kansas City.
And here's where the Republicans stand on delegates following yesterday's primaries. Reagan has 429. The next largest block is the uncommitted group, 346, and Gerald Ford, by our calculation, has 333. Church of Idaho ran in his first primary yesterday in Nebraska against the Jimmy Carter bandwagon, and in one of the closest elections of the year, Church beat Carter. He spent 12 days in Nebraska to Carter's 1.5 and spent about 3 times as much money. Here's how it came out. Church, 39%. Carter, 38%, a difference of about 1,800 votes. Jimmy Carter said, "You can't win them all," but Church was ecstatic. Bob Jameson was with him.
Frank Church had a smile as big as Jimmy Carter's ever is when he acknowledged his victory early today in Lincoln, Nebraska. Some polls 2 weeks ago showed him 14 points behind Carter, and Church sounded like a man who down deep didn't expect to win.
If the present trend continues, we really have pulled out a political miracle here in Nebraska.
Today, Church was still as happy and still calling his win a miracle. The key, he said, was the fact voters who earlier favored Hubert Humphrey or Edward Kennedy switched to him. And he said Humphrey's recent restatement of his non-candidacy was a very big help. But Church said he won on his own, that this proves his candidacy is for real. In Denver, where he changed planes en route to Oregon, Church met reporters. He said the Nebraska win stops the stampede to Carter's bandwagon.
An attempt was being made to stampede Democrats. I kept saying that I didn't think the nomination was in the bag, and that Midwestern voters and Western voters were very independent-minded and would not be stampeded.
Was your victory there a fluke?
Well, I hardly think it was a fluke. I campaigned hard. I came from behind. I came from nowhere, in fact.
Church predicted he will win Oregon and the primaries in other Northwest states, that Nebraska was the state which launched a drive that will project him to the convention with momentum. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Denver.
Jimmy Carter's next trouble spot is Maryland, where his polls show he may be behind California's Governor Edmund Brown, Jr. Carter campaigned for Maryland's rural vote today. He visited a poultry farm. On a local television broadcast, he was asked about his loss in Nebraska.
Well, I would rather have come in first in Nebraska. I can't deny it. And I thought I would come in first. Senator Church concentrated almost all of his efforts the last month or so in Nebraska. He spent 3 or 4 times as much money as I did in Nebraska. He had a good organization, and I think he's a superb campaigner. I need you all to help me now.
Carter still feels he's winning enough delegates to put together a first ballot nomination. But the prospect of a strong run by Brown in Maryland, competition from Udall in Michigan, and the thought that Church will be back in other Western primaries is still unsettling to the Carter camp.
Just a little more than a week ago, Carter was talking about changing the strategy of his campaign, spending less time on the road, more time at home, working by telephone. Now there's no more thought of that. Carter intends to campaign all out through the last of the primaries. Robert Hager, NBC News, Salisbury, Maryland.
There was also voting in Connecticut yesterday as part of the selection of delegates to the Democratic Presidential Convention. Jimmy Carter, who had not campaigned in Connecticut, narrowly beat Mo Udall, who had. Udall's second-place finish helped keep him in the race, as did Jimmy Carter's defeat in Nebraska. Udall was in Michigan today, setting his sights again on Carter, and he spent a few moments looking at one of his new TV commercials, which deals with the charge that Carter waffles on the issues.
On the morning of April 15th, Jimmy Carter said he was against the strip mining bill. Then, that afternoon, he said he was for it.
Today, Udall watched a new commercial he has planned for Michigan voters. Udall is putting all his time and money into Michigan in a desperate effort to stop a Carter avalanche here. The Connecticut and Nebraska results gave him hope.
Well, I think we're going to look back and say May 11 was the day that the Carter bandwagon began to slow down and grind to a halt. In Nebraska, Frank Church, with a well-financed campaign and devoting a lot of time, proved that if you can get the money to make your case against Carter and get the opportunity to take him on, that he can be defeated.
Udall knows that he cannot win in Michigan without labor support, so he went to a picket line to ask striking rubber workers for their votes. Getting labor won't be easy for Udall. United Auto Workers, the biggest union in the state, is backing Carter.
Well, I want you to know whose side I'm on here. I'm on the side of the rubber workers.
Udall is not predicting victory here in Michigan, but he says he will run a close second, win 40 or 50 delegates. Then he says he'll continue the fight against Jimmy Carter in the major primaries ahead. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Detroit.
And here's where the Democrats now stand on delegates to their nominating convention. Carter has 571. Scoop Jackson, retired as an active candidate in the primaries, has 201. Udall is third in delegates with 186, and George Wallace, who's cut back on campaigning, has 143. Adlai Stevenson of Illinois has 86 delegates credited to him. Some of those are Mayor Daley's people. Hubert Humphrey has 58. Frank Church now has 16, and there are 300 uncommitted. All in all, the Democrats have now chosen more than half of their convention delegates. There was more news today about the United States, the Soviet Union, and American politics. As we reported last night, some officials in Washington believe that a ceremony involving President Ford and a treaty with the Russians was canceled because of politics. The treaty sets up controls on peaceful nuclear tests. Ronald Reagan has been critical of the administration's policy of détente with the Soviet Union, and a case can be made that pictures of Mr. Ford signing that treaty would be bad politics now from the White House point of view. In addition, the Russians had scheduled a ceremony in the Kremlin, which has now been canceled, and presumably that would have involved the treaty. As we also reported last night, the White House says politics is not involved. Press Secretary Ron Nessen said today the delay in signing the treaty is purely mechanical. Ronald Reagan was asked about all of this today. Kenley Jones has that story.
Part of Reagan's campaign strategy has been to put the president on the defensive, to get Mr. Ford to react to what Reagan says and does rather than the other way around. Reagan's criticism of détente is an example. So Reagan was pleased to hear reports that Mr. Ford has delayed signing the nuclear pact for political reasons.
Well, if I had a hand in delaying it, I'm pleased.
You're opposed to Governor?
What?
Are you opposed to the pact on nuclear arms?
I just think that the people have a right to know more about what are in those treaties and in those pacts before we come to an agreement. And I am concerned with regard to what we might have given away, particularly in connection with the cruise missile, which I know was of great interest to the Soviet Union.
Reagan's top campaign advisors flew to Kentucky last night for a strategy session, which included a discussion about how to get more uncommitted delegates to declare themselves for Reagan. They believe more than 30 uncommitted delegates in New York favor Reagan, including the 15 who announced their support today. Those delegates have been ready to declare themselves in Reagan's camp for some time, but were asked to wait until now to give the announcement maximum impact going into the Michigan primary. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Lexington, Kentucky.
How many?
In New York, the 15 Republicans, all previously uncommitted delegates from Brooklyn, publicly declared for Reagan. Their county chairman claimed it was the beginning of a trend.
I certainly think it shows that there is serious support in the Northeast. I expect in the next few days or next couple of weeks that there will be other delegates from New York and the Northeast announcing their support for Governor Reagan. And I think this will be extremely significant down the road in Kansas City.
The Republican state chairman, who leans toward President Ford, admitted Reagan might get 36 New York votes, but said there would be no stampede.
If we move up for uncommitted pasture at any time, it'll be because we think that we're doing what's best for the people of the state, but it won't be because of a small group of people who
I perceived right from the start as being basically ideologically attuned to the candidacy of Ronald Reagan.
Rosenbaum said a large block of Northeastern delegates would stay uncommitted and wield the balance of power at the convention. Richard Hunt, NBC News, New York.
His delegate count now shows Reagan leading the president by more than 100 votes. We have Reagan with 444 delegates. Our figures indicate Ford has 333, and we have 331 in the uncommitted category. Now, the Ford organization is starting a drive to get some of those uncommitted votes. Tom Brokaw has the story in Washington.
The Ford Campaign Committee hopes to have between 30 and 100 uncommitted delegates publicly in the president's corner by the weekend. Apparently, most of the effort is concentrated on Pennsylvania, where there are 103 uncommitted delegates. A Pennsylvania Republican familiar with that group figures most are leaning toward the president. Also, Senator Barry Goldwater has asked the Ford Campaign Committee to stop using a radio commercial in which Goldwater strongly criticizes Ronald Reagan's Panama Canal position. A Goldwater spokesman said the senator didn't realize that his comments would become a commercial. He doesn't want to leave the impression that he's endorsing either candidate. The Ford Campaign Committee is a lot more unhappy about widely published pictures of Campaign Committee Chairman Rogers Morton looking disconsolate, sitting next to a table full of liquor bottles the night of the Nebraska primary. A committee spokesman said that was a cheap shot, claiming that reporters were among those drinking from those bottles. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the White House.
Jimmy Carter came to New York today to make a major policy speech on nuclear tests, but that was overshadowed by news that Soviet diplomats in this country have been contacting Carter's staff people trying to get information from him. Robert Hager has the Carter story.
In a news conference in New York, Carter confirmed representatives of the Soviet government and 10 or 12 other governments as well had contacted his Washington office and asked for private meetings with him.
I've sent word back to all of them that I am not a nominee. I'm still conducting the campaign. I have no interest in meeting with ambassadors or representatives of foreign nations. And I will not do this at all, even during the general election, without careful prior consultation with our own Secretary of State. I think it's inappropriate, to be frank with you, for them to inject themselves into our domestic political scene or to insinuate that they might. And obviously, for a foreign nation to insinuate that they have any influence on a campaign is not of benefit to a candidate. It's probably a detriment to the campaign of the person.
But Peter Bourne, who heads Carter's Washington office, has met informally with lower-level representatives of several governments simply seeking information about Carter. Bourne says the Soviets have been the most persistent.
Well, originally they would come every few weeks, but since Pennsylvania, I guess we've had contact 2 or 3 times a week with them. These would be with different people.
But Bourne claimed the Soviets have not tried to influence the campaign. They only wanted information, for instance, about détente.
This is one of the areas that they wanted to get a reading on, and they've been very eager to have copies of all of Carter's foreign policy speeches, his positions on a number of foreign policy issues. And I think they want to prepare themselves in terms of understanding what kind of person they'd be dealing with.
All this interest in the Soviet development comes at an unfortunate time for Carter, on a day when he had come here to United Nations headquarters in New York to make what campaign aides described as a major position statement on nuclear energy. Speaking to an international conference of scientists and diplomats, Carter said all nuclear explosions ought to be banned, even underground tests, however small they may be.
There's one step that can be taken at once. The United Nations and the Soviet Union should conclude an agreement prohibiting all nuclear explosions for a period of at least 5 years, whether they be weapons tests or so-called peaceful nuclear explosions, and encourage all other nations to join.
Carter is sensitive to charges he doesn't take clear positions, so he'd worked carefully on this one, only to find it upstaged by news of the Soviet contact with his campaign workers. Robert Hager, NBC News, New York.
Mary, the tempo of campaigning picked up today. The president was out working the border states on his way to Michigan. Reagan was in Michigan describing himself as an underdog, saying it would be something of a miracle for him to win in Michigan. Actually, he has a chance to win there. Here's more on Reagan, reported by Kenley Jones.
Reagan is spending just a little more than 24 hours campaigning in Michigan. When he arrived in Flint last night, about 500 people were waiting at the airport to greet him.
Got a lot of friends here.
I'm beginning to think so.
Next week, we'll show.
One of Reagan's top aides said the crowd's enthusiasm reminded him of Texas, where Reagan crushed President Ford at the polls. Crossover voting helped Reagan in Texas, and it could be extremely helpful to him here, too, where it is also allowed. At a news conference today in Detroit, Reagan was asked why he is spending so little time in a state where he might hand President Ford a fatal defeat. He said his time and resources are limited.
I think in trying to evaluate priorities, you would have had to accept that I was an underdog here in this state. It has only been in the last few days that there's been any talk that possibly there is more support than had been anticipated here.
Reagan and his advisors have simply been caught by surprise by the strength of his momentum going into the Michigan primary. They believe a hastily rearranged schedule now would do more harm than good by giving the impression they really expect to win here when in fact they do not. Not only that, but if Reagan could beat the president by campaigning only one day in Mr. Ford's home state, it would be a bigger upset than anyone ever imagined. Ken Lee Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Detroit.
The president was in Tennessee today. He denied that he had postponed a ceremony at which he was to have signed a nuclear treaty with the Russians. The charge has been made that Mr. Ford postponed the signing because he was worried about alienating conservative voters who might vote for Reagan. Today, Mr. Ford said that isn't true, and he defended the terms of the treaty. John Cochran reports.
The president told reporters in Memphis he did not postpone signing of the underground test limitation treaty because it might hurt him politically.
This is a breakthrough that 5 or 6 presidents before me have sought to attain. But because we were firm, because we had good relations, I was able to obtain an on-site inspection agreement with the Soviet Union in the nuclear field. I'm very proud of it.
Everywhere he went today, Mr. Ford repeated his new campaign slogan, peace, prosperity, and trust. Crowds were friendly, but not entirely friendly. The president faces the danger here of another large crossover vote for Reagan from conservative Democrats. But Mr. Ford's aides still think Tennessee offers his best chance for a victory in the South since the Florida primary more than 2 months ago.
The president will spend the weekend in his home state, Michigan, where he will campaign on board a special train. His workers here in Tennessee wanted him to do the same thing, but Mr. Ford decided that if he was going to spend the time and money that whistle-stop campaigning requires, then he would do it in the state he must win. And that's Michigan, not Tennessee. John Cochran, NBC News, with the Ford campaign in Memphis.
Jimmy Carter seized the affair of the alleged postponed treaty signing today. Carter said there are increasing signs that our nation's foreign policy has become hostage to Republican Party politics. Carter also said there is not one good reason why Governor Reagan should hold a veto over foreign policy. Insofar as he does, we face, said Carter, a shameful and dangerous situation. George Meany of the AFL-CIO, one labor leader who's been cool to the Carter campaign, spent an hour with Carter today, a carefully non-committal hour. Robert Hager spent a long day with Carter, and here is his report.
At 6 this morning, Carter was out meeting rank-and-file workers in Michigan. But AFL-CIO leaders have been cool to Carter's candidacy. Today, after months of trying, he finally got in to see Meany. AFL-CIO's support is extremely important. The labor organization has about 14 million members, and its political arm may have around $4 million to spend on the election. The meeting with Meany was private. Later, a spokesman described the union's position.
It's neutral. The Executive Council of the AFL-CIO in February 1975 decided that it would remain neutral until the conventions of both parties had been held. That's the position then, remains the position today.
I did not ask Mr. Meany for his support or his endorsement. We did discuss the prospects of delegate acquisition, and I think there was a general feeling that I'm in a strong position as a prospective nominee, and I would hope that after the convention, if I am the nominee, that I would have Mr. Meany's support and other leaders around the country.
But for now, AFL-CIO leaders are still reported as uneasy over the prospect of Carter as the Democratic nominee. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
Make another strong showing against Jimmy Carter, as he did earlier this week in Connecticut. If conservative Michigan Democrats cross over to the Republican primary to vote for Ronald Reagan, that would improve Udall's chances next Tuesday. And California Governor Jerry Brown said today he can win the Democratic nomination even though, in his words, the pundits and commentators have already coronated one candidate. We are checking with Edwin Newman on the word coronate. The Democratic Party Platform Committee began a few days of hearings in Washington today, a harbinger of the politics of this summer. Today was mostly personnel matters. Rhode Island's Governor Philip Noel stepped down as permanent chairman because of a remark he made recently which angered civil rights groups. Noel said he was giving up the post in the interest of party unity and got a round of applause. Minnesota Governor Wendell Anderson was then elected permanent chairman. Catherine Mackin covered this afternoon's session.
As Governor Anderson took over, a subcommittee heavy with Jimmy Carter supporters also was elected to begin writing the party's platform. Democratic leaders want the platform to emphasize the economy, especially full employment. Labor leader George Meany sent word that if economic conditions don't improve, there may be another deep recession. Meany and Governor George Wallace did not appear because they would not cross a picket line of striking NBC employees. Party Chairman Robert Strauss said Democrats are united this year and won't repeat their mistakes of 4 years ago.
Richard Nixon didn't elect himself in 1968 and 1972, and the Republicans didn't elect him. The Democratic Party, in myopia, bitterness, pettiness, and often downright stupidity, brought Richard Nixon and then Gerald Ford upon the American people. But let me assure our Republican friends, and let me assure the American people as a whole, we Democrats have learned our lessons and we'll not make the same mistakes again.
Tomorrow, the Platform Committee will hear from leading Democrats in Congress. Again, the emphasis will be the economy. House Leader Tip O'Neill is expected to present this 271-page proposal. Its objective is to revitalize the nation's economy over the next 5 years by creating 12 million new jobs and cutting taxes $10 million. The main problem with platforms of political parties, all political parties, is that they are written and soon forgotten. If this year's is an exception, it will be the first one. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, Washington.
The coolest, hottest, wildest colors. Hundreds of colors, only from Pittsburgh Paints. The Color Company.
Our nightly news special this evening is a two-part look at two important presidential primaries which take place tomorrow in Michigan and in Maryland. In Maryland, the contest is mainly between Jimmy Carter, whose string of political victories began last January in Iowa, and California Governor Jerry Brown, for whom Maryland is the first primary contest. The Baltimore Sun came out with a poll today showing that Carter is slightly ahead of Brown by 3 points, but also showing a very large percentage of undecided voters, 25 to 30%. Our man Tom Pettit has been in Maryland watching Brown and Carter, and here is his report.
Edmund G. Brown, Jr., Jerry Brown, governor of California, with visions of accepting the Democratic presidential nomination next July at the convention in Madison Square Garden. Here in Maryland, Brown's instant campaign has given him an early lead. Jimmy Carter's master plan had not figured on Jerry Brown, or what has become the Jimmy and Jerry show.
I think we're ready for a new generation of leadership.
He's, got no chance to be elected president.
He who is first shall be last, and he who is last shall be first.
I think Jerry's a fine young man.
I don't think that one man...
Brown is a 38-year-old maverick from California.
Magic solutions.
Carter, the maverick from Georgia, is 51. Brown is a bachelor. Carter is not a bachelor. Carter is a practicing Southern Baptist. Brown studied for the Roman Catholic priesthood, but he is no longer a practicing Catholic. Even so, he has become popular among Catholics in Maryland. The city of Baltimore is heavily Catholic, and it is a city of ethnically pure neighborhoods. Among blacks, Carter is doing very well. But Brown is making a big effort among blacks. Still, if he meets with local ministers, Carter meets with singer Ray Charles, or walks the streets holding the hand of a little black girl. Brown is a bundle of energy. Carter is a bundle of determination. You can see the difference in their handshaking styles.
Hi, Jimmy Carter. Good to see you. Thank you, man. It's good to see you.
Neither Carter nor Brown lacks self-confidence.
I look on myself now as a candidate who might very well be the nominee, almost surely, even before the convention finishes its first ballot.
I think if in 2 weeks I can get so close to Carter in Maryland, I would imagine in 2 months I have a very good opportunity to get the Democratic nomination.
Certainly Jerry Brown is an overnight political and journalistic sensation. The establishment politicians of Maryland seem to like him. Carter has been put on the defensive by his opponent, who is quick-witted and sarcastic, who also has an anti-Washington halo. Carter may need George Wallace to save his neck. 4 years ago, Wallace won in Maryland. Today, he made his only appearance of the campaign in the state. But if Wallace can win any of the Catholic white working-class votes away from Jerry Brown, that would help Jimmy Carter. It is ironic that Jimmy Carter should need help from George Wallace. And it is ironic that Jerry Brown, who in many ways is so much like Jimmy Carter, could turn out to be the last faint hope of the Stop Carter movement. So tune in tomorrow and see how the Jerry and Jimmy show turns out. Tom Pettit, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Maryland.
We're going in.
Carter faces some opposition in the Michigan primary tomorrow from a...
Jimmy show turns out. Tom Pettit, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Maryland.
We're going in.
Carter faces some opposition in the Michigan primary tomorrow from another member of the Stop Carter movement, Congressman Mo Udall, who has managed to stay in the primaries by coming in second in several of them. Udall was barnstorming Michigan today, asking voters to help him pull off what he called a surprise by beating Carter. But the main interest in Michigan is on the Republican side. It appears to be a make-or-break state for Gerald Ford. If he loses in Michigan to Ronald Reagan, it could ruin his chances for the rest of the season. He was campaigning in Michigan so hard this weekend that once, in a crowd, he shook his own daughter Susan's hand. John Hart reports on the Michigan primary.
N45.
There'll be bingo again tonight at the Corporal Richard Mengy Post VFW Hall in Macomb County. A couple hundred people will come for a game of minor chances the night before the primary, the game of considerable chance. Every kind of voter will play, the kind that Gerald Ford is afraid of, like John Solera.
I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote Republican in the primaries.
For whom?
For Reagan.
Why?
To get Ford out.
B13.
The kind that Jimmy Carter is afraid of, the Wallace voter Carter's accustomed to picking up this year, but can lose in Michigan, like Alex Chisholm.
Vote for George Wallace. And this time, Ronald Reagan.
The question in Michigan is, how many Alex Chisholms are there? Where will the other Wallace voters of either party go? The Michigan ballot makes it easy for them to go anywhere, the simplest ballot of the year. Everyone gets the same ballot with all the candidates on it. There's no registration by party. You can choose your party in the voting booth. And it's easy for one party to switch and mess up the other one, as the leaders of Local 214, the United Auto Workers of Macomb County, have been urging their members to do.
But this is one way of our showing our displeasure with the President's administration. We will cross over, and hopefully we can remove Ford as a presidential nominee. In fact, remove him totally from office.
Gerald Ford sort of put a little embarrassment on our country with his presidential pardon of Richard Nixon. And hopefully we can give Gerald Ford a little embarrassment by not being able to carry his own state in a primary.
Yeah, but we'd like to make it clear, though, in November that we are going to vote Democratic, so we're not rebels, you know. We just want to show Jerry Ford what we think of him.
There's no telling how many switchers there will be in Michigan, but you can see the potential for mischief. What happens here in Macomb County is important because politicians who've carried Michigan have always carried Macomb, a suburb of Detroit. This is a family community. Most people own their own homes, live modestly, and vote Democratic. Wallace carried this county and the state 4 years ago. But the busing issue was powerful then and no longer is. Neither is Wallace. His voters are, if they vote Republican, choosing between Ford and Reagan, they will, by their absence, have an influence in the Democratic contest between Carter and Udall. Michigan is very important to all of them.
67.
And all of them have a chance that is unpredictable. John Hart, NBC News, Roseville, Michigan.
I remember the feeling the first time he held me in his arms.
David Brinkley reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. In the Maryland and Michigan primaries today, 313 Democratic and Republican delegates will be chosen, and some political reputations will be helped or hurt. NBC News has spent the day polling voters in both states as they came out of the polling booths, and this is what we've learned so far from voters who voted early. President Ford appears to be running strongly in that group against Ronald Reagan in Michigan. There is no indication of a massive turnout of Wallace Democrats for Reagan. Our early polling also shows that Jimmy Carter in the Democratic primary in Michigan is getting many of those former Wallace voters. Carter is also doing well among Michigan black voters, while Mo Udall is running well in the suburbs. In Maryland, however, our poll shows that Carter is running less well than Jerry Brown, his California challenger. That could change as we get more returns and the evening goes on. The main contest today is in Michigan, and here's how the voting was going there. The turnout in Michigan this morning was light in many places. In Detroit, the turnout was reported to be only half as large this morning as it was in the Michigan primary 4 years ago. In other parts of the state, it was only slightly greater than that. The only place where we have reports of heavy turnout was in Grand Rapids, the home district of Gerald Ford, which may be good news for the president. David?
Until this spring's primaries, President Ford never ran for anything outside of one district in Maryland. Well, since he has run elsewhere, he has not always been very happy with the results. Now, today, he was running in Michigan again, and a great deal and possibly everything depended on the results. A report from Tom Brokaw in Washington.
For the record, Press Secretary Ron Nessen said today that President Ford expects to win in Michigan. When asked if the president could survive a loss in his home state, Nessen would answer only, Mr. Ford does not expect to lose. President Ford told a reporter essentially the same thing, but conceded that it would be difficult for a candidate to win the general election if he could not carry his own home state. Privately, even the president's most loyal advisors acknowledged that it would be hard for the Ford campaign to survive a Michigan loss, so they're very nervous tonight. They recognize that a Michigan win only keeps the president's chances alive, that on the last day of the primary campaign, he has to face Reagan in his home state, California. Today, Secretary Kissinger, who has been a major Reagan target, decided not to accept two major California speaking invitations before the primary. A State Department spokesman said the secretary was afraid that his trip might be misinterpreted. It could also be counterproductive. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Washington.
Jimmy Carter was campaigning in other states today, carefully discounting in advance the possibility of trouble in Michigan or Maryland or both. With him was our reporter, Robert Hager.
Carter was already campaigning for next week's primaries, with rallies in Arkansas and Kentucky. But he was concerned about today's voting and the fact that other candidates have concentrated their efforts on individual primaries.
Right now, today in Maryland, we have a tough race on our hands. In Michigan, we have a tough race on our hands. I may win both of them. I may not win either one. But then next Tuesday, we'll have 6 more. I've got 14 primaries in May alone.
Carter was startled today by one of his own polls in Michigan, showing a last-minute shift of many of his supporters who now say they plan to vote in the Republican primary there.
We have indications that the crossover might be as much as 12 or 13% of the votes in Michigan, which I understand would be about 800,000 votes that would leave the Democratic Party, where they ordinarily cast their ballots, and go into the Republican Party.
And this could change the outcome of the election. It could cost me the election in Michigan just because the people in that state are much more intensely interested in either electing their home state leader, Mr. Ford, or defeating Mr. Ford to embarrass the Republicans.
Carter campaigners are worried about today's primaries. They've always felt the Maryland race was close. Now they're afraid their support in Michigan could be eroding. Nonetheless, to await tonight's returns, Carter will go to Michigan, the state where he expects his better performance. Robert Hager, NBC News in Jonesboro, Arkansas.
Governor Brown of California, certainly unusual and possibly even a unique candidate for president, came all the way across the country to run in Maryland, seems to have enjoyed the experience and has now gone on to other states, hoping to pick up uncommitted delegates. Here's a report from Rick Davis in Newark, New Jersey.
The enthusiasm Governor Brown generated in Maryland followed him when he arrived in Rhode Island last night. 1,000 persons were waiting at a rally in Cranston, including the lieutenant governor, the state party chairman, and labor leaders. Brown is not on the ballot in the June 1st primary. But his backers say the majority of the delegates listed as uncommitted on that ballot favor the California governor. He wants their votes at the convention.
I can't see you out there, but I can hear you.
This morning, Brown was working the young crowd. At LaSalle Academy, they welcomed the former Jesuit seminarian as one of their own. He said the nation needs a new generation of moral leadership. He left them standing and shouting. At a news conference, he was asked how he would do against Carter in the Maryland primary today.
We'll have to wait to see what the outcome is. All the indicators are that it's close. I'm optimistic. I'm confident.
This afternoon, Brown arrived in New Jersey. Again, some local politicians were in the airport crowd. Brown is courting the uncommitted delegates listed on the June 8th primary ballot here, hoping for their support at the convention. Governor Brown returns to Maryland tonight to await election results. Win or lose, he flies to Oregon early tomorrow morning to campaign as a write-in candidate in that state's primary. Rick Davis, NBC News, Newark.
Congressman Mo Udall, whose fate in the Michigan primary is still in the hands of the voters there, told NBC News today that he will not mount an active campaign in the Oregon primary. Udall will leave that contest to Frank Church and to Jerry Brown, who are trying to stop Jimmy Carter. Udall will concentrate his campaigning in other primary states. He has been badly hurt by the lack of federal matching campaign funds. We'll have more on politics later in the program. Through several presidential elections, this country has seen the candidates turn to the use of jet airplanes, computers, scientific polling, and carefully contrived television commercials. And we have seen predictions the campaign style was changing, moving toward more scientific and mechanical approaches to the voters, and away from the old-fashioned nonsense of handshaking tours, country music, balloons, and free watermelon. Well, it hasn't happened yet. There is a lot of polling and more or less scholarly analysis and a lot of television commercials when they can afford them. But essentially, the candidates still spend their time simply shaking hands, one at a time, as it has been done since the days of Franklin Pierce and Millard Fillmore. Nobody has proved that handshaking wins all that many votes. It may even lose some. But it's useful to the candidate. It gives him something to do with his hands and forces him to remember that with all the computers and the polls and the commercials, there really are people out there. John? Earlier this year, Jimmy Carter was campaigning for the presidency in a department store. There was a big crowd, and he was shaking a lot of hands. Now, Carter shakes hands with a speed and determination not matched by many candidates. Suddenly, Carter found himself shaking the cold plastic hand of a store dummy, a mannequin in a dress. Quickly, realizing his mistake, Carter turned to one of his advance men and said, "Better give her a brochure," which was not enough to get the department store dummy vote, but a good example of what volunteers and advance men have to put up with. They are the true combat troops of politics, and Don Oliver has been watching some of them.
And I came up from Georgia to campaign for my cousin Jimmy, who's running for president.
Registered Republican, dear.
Oh, thank you anyway.
I'm campaigning for Jimmy Carter. Could I ask you to consider him?
No way.
No sale. No sale.
Who
are you for?
It is not easy to be a worker in a presidential campaign, not even if you were a cousin of the candidate.
That's nepotism.
You're saying to vote for him for your cousin. There must be a better reason to vote for a man other than he being your
Well,
cousin.
he's great.
Connie Carter is one of 125 Georgians who have been in Maryland at their own expense working for Jimmy Carter. Another cousin, Hugh, is a group leader sending forces into the field.
And Karen Carter, Chip's wife, will arrive at 1:15.
Is he a good man?
He is a good man. I
Yes,
can tell you
you
that.
can vouch for that.
I found out firsthand.
Carter's relatives were all over the place, but they were just a part of the field operation in Maryland. The headquarters, a former dress shop in downtown Baltimore. 20 paid staff workers, 40 full-time volunteers, and 500 or 600 part-time volunteers. Presided over by another Georgian, a 25-year-old named Philip Wise. Jimmy Carter was once his Sunday school teacher. He's known him all his life. More recently, Wise directed the successful campaigns in Florida and Wisconsin. He had 9 days to try to produce another victory in Maryland. The job is to contact voters by phone or in person, get publicity, and organize the candidates' public appearances in the state.
The only problem with putting the stage there is there's a floor-to-ceiling device there.
This is the stage he was talking about in Cheverly, Maryland, at an American Legion Hall. This advance man had 2 days' notice to set up a rally here. He had to hire the hall, buy the balloons, have the signs made, hire a band, work with the Secret Service on security, arrange police protection, and get 7,000 flyers distributed to attract a crowd. All of this was not being done to acquaint the people of Prince George's County with Jimmy Carter. Not really. This was strictly a media event. Time to get the maximum coverage from radio, television, and the newspapers. Carter had wanted to spend this day resting, but his advisors decided he couldn't afford to be missing from the TV screens or the front pages. The advance man had done his work. The small hall was filled, the applause loud, and the cameramen got their pictures. The last act of the Maryland organization was to send workers to the polls today to show voters how to mark the ballot for the Carter delegates. In a few hours, they'll know how well they've done their work. Don Oliver, NBC News, Baltimore.
President Ford, the chief executive, welcomed Golda Meir of Israel to the White House today, but Gerald Ford, the candidate for president, was exultant and perhaps a little surprised at his victories in the primaries yesterday. In Maryland, Mr. Ford beat Ronald Reagan by 58 to 42%. And in Michigan, a landslide. Ford with 65%, Reagan with 34%. Tom Brokaw has more on the president's joyous mood.
A presidential advisor said Mr. Ford has been going around the White House today displaying pocket-sized cards showing the election results from various Michigan small towns and counties. Aides say he's seldom been happier.
I don't think Betty and I had a more enjoyable evening than last evening since we've been in the White House. Yesterday was a great day, and I think it's restored the momentum. We think we have a fighting chance in the state of California. We're going to make a big effort there. The momentum has started. We're going to work at keeping it going, and we're optimistic that we can get a first ballot victory in Kansas City.
Realistically, the president's top campaign strategist recognized that all of this euphoria today must be measured against what could be a very rough round of primaries next Tuesday. 6 states in the South and West, all with the elections on the same day. And so far, Oregon is the only state solidly in the president's column. But his campaign advisors figure that Mr. Ford should be able to get an even split of delegates with Reagan out of those 6 primaries. At the same time, however, in the upper reaches of the administration, there is increasing concern that this continuing battle between the president and Reagan is seriously eroding Republican chances in the general election. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the White House.
In Michigan yesterday, NBC News polled nearly 1,500 Republican voters as they came out of the polling booths. Those poll figures, plus his own observations, make up this report from John Hart in Detroit on what happened yesterday in Michigan.
President Ford won Michigan not so much because it's his home state as because it was alien to Ronald Reagan's campaign. NBC's polling of voters shows that Reagan's issues, détente and the Panama Canal, were wasted here.
Michigan's Republicans favor détente and a treaty with Panama more than Republicans have in any primary state so far. The presidency helped Ford immensely. 45% of Ford's voters were attracted to him on the basis of experience. Only 4% of Reagan's voters were attracted by his experience. Ford attracted twice as many voters on the qualities of honesty and trust as did Reagan. The other thing is organization. After the president's defeats in Texas and Indiana, the Michigan Ford campaign finally shook some money out of Washington and established telephone banks all over the state and contacted 3 times as many Republicans as did Reagan's people, who 1 week before this primary had 4 telephones in the office. Finally, the crossover vote that made George Wallace the winner here 4 years ago did not cross over this time because busing is no longer a violent issue. But the ghost of crossovers past sent Ford's organization into the streets and his voters to the polls. John Hart, NBC News, Detroit.
Despite Ford's big victory yesterday, in which he won all 43 Maryland delegates to the Republican convention and 55 delegates in Michigan, he is still behind in delegates. Ronald Reagan, who won 29 yesterday, has 519 delegates. Ford has 441, and there are 355 uncommitted delegates. One very important aspect of the president's victories yesterday is that more of that 355 uncommitted Republican delegates may now be more likely to support Ford, and the uncommitteds may be the key to the Republican nomination. Yesterday's Michigan Democratic primary was one of the closest contests this year. Jimmy Carter pulled it out by coming in just about 2,000 votes ahead of Mo Udall, with the 2 men polling more than 600,000 votes. Here's the final tally. Carter wins with about 44%. Udall is second with 43%, and actually it's a bit closer than that. George Wallace, who won in Michigan 4 years ago with 51% of the vote, tallied only 7% yesterday. Robert Hager is traveling with the Carter campaign. Here is his report on Carter's reaction to the vote in Michigan.
Carter was disappointed in last night's returns, but in his Michigan headquarters, he didn't show it.
I will win the nomination in Madison Square Garden with your help on the first ballot.
Today, Carter came west to Oregon and Nevada, states where he faces more trouble next week. Had the Carter bandwagon been stopped?
Well, I never have claimed that we had a bandwagon going. After Pennsylvania, I predicted that by the end of the primary season we'd have 1,000 delegates. And I now think that after next week we'll have 1,000 delegates. Before California, Ohio, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and a couple of other states. So we're way ahead of our prediction, even after the great Pennsylvania victory.
Carter's own delegate count differs from NBC's, but he claims his is more realistic.
This one right here.
Carter feels that in the 3 weeks of primaries left, it would be pointless to concentrate time and money in an effort to knock off any one of the candidates. Instead, he plans to concentrate his efforts on building his delegate total and hopes to build that to the point that it's so great that he can't possibly be stopped. Robert Hager, NBC News, Portland, Oregon.
Congressman Mo Udall's second-place finish in Michigan, plus his desperate lack of federal matching funds, has caused him to cancel his campaign in the Oregon primary. But Udall will continue to run in other primaries. Charles Quinn of our staff was with Udall today and with him last night in Detroit.
Oh, what a night here in Motown we're having.
It was another second-place finish for Udall, but it was close, and it put new life into his campaign. Today, he flew on to Ohio and Kentucky, claiming that yesterday's results, plus Frank Church's win in Nebraska last week, prove that the country is taking a second look at Carter. He said that even though Church and Brown had beaten Carter, he didn't think either would get the nomination.
Governor Brown is exciting. He's interesting. He's the new man in the race. He moved in with very substantial money and the support of political organizations in Maryland and won his first time out. But I don't think the country really is prepared to give the nomination to someone who's not been through this primary process. The same thing with Senator Church. It's a whole new ball game, and I'm in the playoffs. I'm going to be the second candidate, second highest number of delegates. And if the convention doesn't want Carter and turns to other candidates, I've got a better chance than anyone you can name of being that choice.
Udall says the name of the game now is delegates. But one of his aides said the name of the game really is winning, something that Udall, after 6 major primary fights, has yet to do. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Louisville.
Perhaps the most interesting political development yesterday was the defeat of Jimmy Carter by California Governor Jerry Brown in the Maryland primary. The score there was Brown 49%, Carter 37%. Our poll in Maryland shows some interesting facts about Brown's victory. He was regarded by his voters as a candidate of the bosses, but some voted for him because they thought he was not a typical politician. He got more of the anti-Washington vote than Carter, but curiously, he was a big winner among federal government workers. Brown won the college vote, the young vote, and the blue-collar vote in Maryland. We tallied that information from 1,600 Democratic voters yesterday. Today, for Brown, it was on to Oregon. Our man, Rick Davis, was with him.
It was cold and raining when Governor Brown arrived. His campaign aides were worried that the first event here would be a failure. It was an outdoor rally. There was no need to worry. 3,000 persons were waiting. Brown is launching a write-in campaign in next Tuesday's primary. Carter, Church, Humphrey, and Udall are among the 10 names on the ballot. Write-ins are difficult in this state. Brown was advised not to try, but he decided to make the effort even before his big victory in Maryland.
But if this many people can come out in the rain, I'm sure a lot more can write in this presidential campaign next Tuesday. Are you ready to help me do that?
Governor Brown spoke of his late entry in the presidential race.
There's another biblical text that goes something like that the laborer who enters the field at the 11th hour is as worthy of hire as he who enters at the first hour. And I'm coming in at the 11th hour, and I'd like a chance. Will you give it to me?
Brown spoke in the cold rain for nearly half an hour, obviously still warmed by his victory in Maryland yesterday. Rick Davis, NBC News, Portland.
Brown may have been warmed by his victory in Maryland, but he got no formally committed delegates there. He entered that race too late to file slates of delegates. And Jimmy Carter is still far ahead of everybody in delegates. Our count now gives Carter 683. Udall is second with 257. Scoop Jackson, no longer running in primary elections, has 211. George Wallace has 140, and there are 317 uncommitted delegates to the Democratic National Convention. And even though he lost in Maryland yesterday, many experts believe that Carter still has a chance to come into that convention with 1,000 delegates, or 200 or 300 more than that. The political impact of the improving economy could affect the campaign of Ronald Reagan. Nevertheless, there are 6 primaries next week. Reagan is expected to do well in at least 5 of them. Today, Reagan was in Arkansas. Last night, he was in Las Vegas. He is trying to ignore everything but the job of getting more delegates. Kenley Jones reports.
Reagan has gambled his chances of winning the nomination on his so-called Sunbelt strategy, concentrating his campaign for delegates in the South and West, where his conservative strength lies. Last night, he was in the perfect place for a gambling man, Las Vegas. Reagan told an enthusiastic crowd of supporters that his strategy is paying off.
We're above the 500 mark. We're close to that halfway point in the delegates we'll need in Kansas City, and we are way ahead of what our projections were as to what we would be at this particular time. Now, the reports from the caucus states look good, and if you people in Nevada will do something next Tuesday that I would like to see you do, well, then we're coming up to Big Casino, which is California with its 167 winner-take-all.
Nevada was the first stop on a campaign swing which will take Reagan to 4 of the 6 states which have primaries next Tuesday. The second stop was Arkansas, where Reagan spoke to a rally at the Little Rock Airport today. A total of 176 delegates will be up for grabs in next Tuesday's primaries, all of them in the South and West. Reagan is betting that he will grab a lion's share of those delegates and regain his momentum going into that Big Casino winner-take-all primary in California. A win there, Reagan believes, would give him good odds to hit the jackpot, a first ballot nomination in Kansas City. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Little Rock, Arkansas.
There were Democratic presidential candidates all over the place today. Jimmy Carter was in Nevada and California. George Wallace was in Arkansas. Mo Udall was in Kentucky and New Jersey. And Jerry Brown, the governor of California, and Senator Frank Church of Idaho, the two newcomers, were both in Nevada and Oregon. Our man Bob Jameson was with Church today. Here's his report from Oregon.
I'm a neighbor.
Frank Church took his campaign to the zoo in Portland today, where there was a media event designed to underscore the role the candidate sees himself filling. Like the tortoise in the fable that overtook the frontrunner, Frank Church sees himself overtaking Jimmy Carter. That was the plan all along, to enter the race late as a fresh face around whom Democrats could gather, and to win in Oregon was important. But that strategy didn't count on Jerry Brown's success last week or his write-in campaign here. And now there is worry that Brown will take votes away from Church, votes he needs to defeat Carter.
Well, I think that the vote will be fragmented, which complicates my problem. My problem is to get all Democrats who are looking for an alternative candidate together. I can win that way. I won in Nebraska, I can win in Oregon.
Church's campaign here won't change much because of Brown's candidacy. Essentially, it is a duplicate of his successful effort in Nebraska. Church is trying to project himself as the only candidate talking about issues. Before this college audience, he said he was running against two governors who speak only in generalities.
Oregonians, the people need to be informed in a presidential campaign so that they can reach an intelligent judgment that's based upon the issues, and this has always been an issue-oriented state.
Church will spend $30,000 on advertising here, including a half-hour TV program to be carried statewide the night before the primary. He will also spend money on telephone banks to ensure a strong Church vote Tuesday. But there is still worry that Jerry Brown's campaign will hurt. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Portland.
And although Hubert Humphrey has said that he is out of active contention in the primaries and that he will authorize no committees to act on his behalf, some of his supporters today organized their own committee to promote his presidential candidacy. Here's that story from Washington, reported by Carol Simpson.
Illinois Congressman Paul Simon and New York Democratic leader Joseph Krangel will file papers for the new committee tomorrow with the Federal Elections Commission and begin raising money immediately. Simon said Jimmy Carter would go to the convention with the most delegates, but Humphrey could still win.
We anticipate that on that first ballot that Senator Humphrey will have approximately 300 delegates. We believe that there is substantial sentiment for Senator Humphrey among those who are pledged to other candidates, and we would anticipate that on a second ballot and a third ballot, if a third ballot is necessary, that there would be a substantial shift in the direction of Senator Humphrey.
Later, reporters asked Senator Humphrey why he doesn't stop the draft movement.
You don't go around kicking people in the teeth. They feel that the convention may turn to me, obviously, and they feel they ought to be prepared. Thank you.
Senator Humphrey said he would reassess his position after the primaries, and if the convention still wants him, he'll be available. Carol Simpson, NBC News, Washington.
The New York Daily News said this evening that Senator Edward Kennedy has changed his mind and that he would accept a genuine draft to be president. The story by James Wiggert says Kennedy would also accept the vice presidential nomination, but only on a ticket headed by Hubert Humphrey. Tonight, however, Senator Kennedy said this, and we quote, "That is his speculation. I stated my position previously, and I have not changed it." Frank Church got $120,000. Good news at last for candidates who have received no federal matching money since March. President Ford and Ronald Reagan are competing for votes in next week's Tennessee primary, and both today were talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is owned and operated by the federal government. In 1964, Barry Goldwater, then a candidate for president, caused a furor when he suggested the TVA might be sold to private interests. Today, President Ford said he is in favor of federal ownership, but he also said that some things about the TVA could be re-examined. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, seemed to be saying he would entertain the idea of selling TVA. Here's a report from Kenley Jones.
Reagan was the guest speaker last night at a Republican dinner in Huntsville, Tennessee, the hometown of Republican Senator Howard Baker. Baker has been campaigning hard for President Ford, but he appeared on the program with Reagan. and invited the governor and his wife Nancy to spend the night in the Baker home.
You know, we're both Republicans. That's important. We're both going to be together when this thing's over, when this primary's finished and we have a nominee. I'll bet you Ronald Reagan and Howard Baker are both working for the Republican nominee, whoever that turns out to be.
Baker's appearance last night was an attempt to show that Republicans can and should unite in November despite their considerable differences. One difference, or at least an apparent difference, between Reagan and President Ford cropped up today during a discussion of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. In Washington, Mr. Ford said he supports TVA as a government-owned facility. In Chattanooga, Reagan was asked if he would consider selling the TVA. At first he said no, then he said this.
I have for many years pointed to the TVA as an example of the government starting out with a flood control project and winding up with the biggest utility industries in the United States, competing with private industry, tax-free and so forth. I think that TVA certainly should be looked at, as should every government agency, but this one should be looked at particularly to see whether this is to the advantage of the people.
Reagan left a clear impression that he would at least look into the idea of selling the TVA, whereas President Ford would not. That difference could be quite important to voters here next Tuesday. Kenley Jones, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign in Tennessee.
Senator Edward Kennedy had some careful comments to make today on yesterday's report that he might be available for a place on the Democratic presidential ticket this year. The New York Daily News said that Kennedy has decided he would accept a genuine draft for the presidential nomination or would serve as a vice presidential candidate on a ticket headed by Hubert Humphrey. Reporters got to Kennedy on this today, and here is what he said.
Well, that's really a matter of speculation by newspaper reporters and commentators. I've indicated my position's unchanged, but I can't really stop speculation.
You can't. What about reports that you might accept a vice presidency spot if Senator Hubert Humphrey got the nomination?
No, my reasons for not accepting the vice presidency are the same ones for the presidency, and I've stated those time and time again, and they remain unchanged.
And you would say then nothing in your personal situation has changed that would make you change your mind about running?
No, I enjoy the work in the Senate. I look forward to it, and I've been very much honored by the people of Massachusetts, and I have every intention of running and being reelected and serving in the United States Senate.
Senator Humphrey was asked today about the report that Kennedy might be available. He told Reuters news agency that a Humphrey-Kennedy ticket would be very popular since, he said, the two of them are the two most popular Democrats. Humphrey told Reuters that he knows that Kennedy is deeply concerned about the direction of Jimmy Carter's anti-Washington campaign. And Humphrey confirmed that Kennedy had urged him to run against Carter in the New Jersey primary. The idea of a Humphrey-Kennedy ticket was the talk of the Democratic Party today, and it came up on Jimmy Carter's campaign trail. Robert Hager has that story.
The Carter campaign plane flew back to Oregon today after a last-minute decision to add 3 more days of campaigning in a state where Governor Brown and Senator Church are running hard. Under Oregon law, Senator Kennedy's name is also on the ballot in Oregon. And on the plane, Carter was asked about the new Kennedy speculation and if it scared him.
I believe it, but it doesn't scare me. When I decided to run for president several years ago now, it was with the presumption that Kennedy would be my opponent and Wallace would be the other one. So what Kennedy decides to do at this late date, or what his supporters decided to do at this late date, would be of interest but not of frightening consequence. I think that Kennedy, if his story is true, that Kennedy will probably pick up substantial additional votes in Oregon compared to what he would have gotten.
In Portland, Oregon, thousands of high school students have been holding a mock political convention this week. Carter stopped by and got a big cheer. But when Carter wasn't around and the mock convention was doing its mock voting, Carter was stopped short of a first ballot nomination. On the second ballot, began to lose support. It was all pretend, but it was exactly the kind of thing Carter's opponents are hoping will happen in real life. Robert Hager, NBC News, Portland, Oregon.
President Ford in his struggle with Ronald Reagan for the Republican presidential nomination. On the eve of 6 state primaries, Mr. Ford now has 700 delegates to the nominating convention locked up. The NBC News delegate count gives Ronald Reagan 534. 152 delegates are still uncommitted. 1,130 delegates are needed to nominate. Ford took the lead over Reagan this weekend when 88 previously uncommitted Pennsylvania delegates came out for him. Today, 119 of the 154-man New York State delegation announced for Mr. Ford. That came when Vice President Rockefeller cashed in on some political IOUs, as Richard Hunt reports.
It was like old times for Vice President Rockefeller, coming back to Albany for a meeting of the Republican organization he built in 15 years as governor. 2 out of 3 Republicans at a caucus of convention delegates owed Rockefeller at least one political favor. And they voted his way. 119 for Gerald Ford, 18 for Ronald Reagan, 15 uncommitted, 2 absent. The New York leaders had planned to stay uncommitted for several weeks longer. But Rockefeller decided to move now.
And I think this is bound to have the psychological effect of the big states, Pennsylvania and New York in the East, having a
bandwagon effect.
Well, you got it.
Brooklyn Republican Chairman George Clark, Jr., leader of the Reagan delegates, had hoped for twice as many votes.
Well, let me tell you what happened. First of all, some of the Reagan people decided not to show up because they were afraid. Number 2, some of the uncommitteds, I believe, are definitely Ronald Reagan voters. And number 3, some of the people today who voted for Gerald Ford are, in fact, for Ronald Reagan.
But Rockefeller left Albany with 119 votes promised and the hope of perhaps a dozen more. Last fall, some conservative Republicans complained that Rockefeller was a political liability, and he withdrew from the ticket. Now the conservatives are looking for delegates, and today Nelson Rockefeller paid them back. Richard Hunt, NBC News, Albany.
President Ford was on the road today when he got the good news from New York. Tom Brokaw was traveling with the president, and here is his report.
The New York decision gave President Ford some extra chips when he made a quick trip into Las Vegas today, gambling that he could pick up some additional votes in tomorrow's Nevada primary. The president insisted the New York vote was a tribute to his administration, that it was not just the result of Vice President Nelson Rockefeller's orders to the delegation.
I believe those delegates believe in the programs that I have had for this country for the last 21 or 22 months. The people in New York State as a whole, as well as the city, know that we've achieved the peace, that we've turned the economy around and restored confidence in the White House. And I think they made that move because they believe in the Ford administration.
President Ford also said the New York vote did nothing to change Rockefeller's status as a lame duck vice president. He will not be on the ticket.
The vice president.
Now that he's done all the campaigning he can for tomorrow's primaries, President Ford returns to work California and what his opponent Ronald Reagan calls the big casino. The California primary June 8th, 167 delegates, winner take all. The president will be in California tonight, tomorrow, and tomorrow night before going on to Ohio and then finally Washington on Wednesday. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, with the president in Las Vegas.
The United States today held more presidential primaries on a single day than ever before. 6 primaries in Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. 179 Democratic delegates and 176 Republican delegates in those states, plus 54 Democratic delegates and party conventions in the state of Missouri. And we have some early returns from the state of Kentucky. In the Republican Kentucky primary, with 13% of the precincts in, Gerald Ford with a sizable lead now, in terms of percentages at least, over Ronald Reagan. And on the Democratic side, 10% of those precincts in, Jimmy Carter, over half the vote. Ellen McCormick, the anti-abortion candidate, with 15%, just ahead of George Wallace, 14%, Congressman Morris Udall, 11%. In addition, NBC News has been polling voters in Tennessee. Our sample among Republicans so far shows substantial strength for Gerald Ford over Ronald Reagan in Tennessee among early voters. But that could change. David?
And there were 3 primaries in the West today, in Oregon, Idaho, and Nevada, with vociferous competition in all of them. It was Ford against Reagan in Reagan's part of the country, and Carter from Georgia against Church and Brown in their part of the country. The polls are still open. President Ford was in California campaigning and looking forward to that primary 2 weeks from today, and Tom Brokaw was with him.
President Ford is looking ahead to the June 8th California primary, and in Los Angeles today, he defended his Secretary of State and administration foreign policy. The president said he would continue to pursue an arms agreement with the Soviet Union, emphasizing there are no secret deals.
Ford family, we are doing nothing behind the backs of the American people or contrary to the constitutional checks and balances on the presidential power to conduct foreign relations with other countries.
In Los Angeles and again in San Jose, the president made it quite clear that he believes Secretary of State Kissinger is doing a good job, that he wants Kissinger to stay. The president was asked if he's elected in November whether he would attempt to convince Kissinger to remain in a new term.
I will return, of course.
Mr. Ford was not as certain when asked how he would do in today's primaries.
I think we'll break at least even. I'm naturally hopeful that we'll get a few more than 50% of them. And from the reports we get in the 6 states, I think that'll take place.
President Ford goes back to the White House tomorrow, and although he'd like to return to California for one more round of campaigning, he may not be able to because of the limit on campaign spending. So his campaign committee has compiled a 3-page list of government officials to come to California and speak for the president. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, with the president in San Jose.
Reagan was not campaigning today, but his staff members were predicting victories in 3 or 4 of the 6 primaries. John?
And now in today's 6 primaries, more returns. The people are still voting in 5 of the 6 states where there's voting today, but we do have returns from Kentucky. And let's have a look now at the Kentucky Republican primary. 16% of the vote in. President Ford holding a substantial lead there, 52% to 45% for Ronald Reagan on our tally board. He's held that as these votes have come in so far this evening. And on the Democratic side in Kentucky, 15% of the precincts reporting Jimmy Carter with more than a majority of the vote. And it doesn't look as though anybody there can catch him in the Kentucky Democratic primary. George Wallace and Ellen McCormick, the anti-abortion candidate, tied with 14%. Congressman Udall way down at this point in the balloting with 10%. David?
Our special tonight is on the Panama Canal and how it has become an issue in the Republican primaries and one of the issues bringing Ronald Reagan his victories. It seems to inflame public opinion, and so it may bring him more since he continues talking about it. Here's a full report on the canal and the political issue from Tom Pettit.
Ocean-going ships from Europe come here to Oregon via the Panama Canal. So does Ronald Reagan. Without the Panama Canal issue, Reagan might not even still be in the race. His Panama position symbolizes his national defense and foreign policy showdown with President Ford.
It's Mom's apple pie. The canal, we built it. It's one of the great wonders of the world. We built it when everyone else had failed. We cured yellow fever in order to do it. And I think the American people just have a pride in which you might as well suggest giving away the White House.
This is the campaign issue which can be photographed. The real Panama Canal, located in Panama. There also is a political Panama Canal, which Reagan discovered in New Hampshire.
What amazed me was that in every meeting, somebody would stand up and ask me, what was this about giving away the canal?
You didn't dream up the idea of the Panama Canal Zone as an issue in New Hampshire, then?
Never thought of it as one. It came out of the people made that an issue.
And you didn't realize right off how potent an issue that was.
I sure didn't.
But Reagan did not exploit the issue and lost New Hampshire. By March, the political canal had stretched into Florida, but too late to win. Finally, in North Carolina, the political canal issue paid off. Reagan won his first primary. Reagan's campaign was on the rise. Ford was pushed onto the defensive. Reagan won Texas, Indiana, Nebraska, partly by painting Ford as a man who would give away both the Panama Canal and American military supremacy. It was the perfect issue to attract conservative Democrats to cross over. This week, Reagan's political canal flows through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas, the southern rim or Sun Belt states where the canal issue works.
We should not be negotiating a giveaway of our sovereignty or the control of the Panama Canal, not in this world today. We will not negotiate predicated on giving up our sovereign rights to the canal or the canal zone. And we will never negotiate under threats of force and violence.
The Reagan Canal strategy is aimed at getting close to 100 delegate votes today in the Sunbelt states.
Help us to look to thee for strength and guidance, remembering
Reagan doesn't have a prayer to win big against Ford in Oregon.
Amen.
What so proudly we hailed as the twilight's
The president talks peace and preparedness to imply that Reagan's canal issue makes him a warmonger or a demagogue.
I don't think it is demagogy to respond to the people who have said to you, look, this is the problem we want solved. What are you going to do about it if you have the chance?
When the United States has serious disagreements with other sovereign nations, we have really only two choices: to fight about it or to talk about it.
I don't believe that our country, number one, should be negotiating under a threat of force and coercion.
Now, there are some who say we should break off negotiations. I think that would be foolhardy.
Are we going to roll over and give up whatever is asked? And if we do, how far does that go?
Threats are not only risky, but rather old-fashioned in today's world.
Ford is expected to win the Oregon primary because this state has a tradition of liberal republicanism and a distaste for war or jingoism. But after Oregon, and especially in California, Reagan's Panama Canal issue may attract enough delegates to create a deadlocked national convention and thus deny a first ballot nomination to anybody. Tom Pettit, NBC News, on the campaign trail in Oregon.
Reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. Gerald Ford today was savoring victory in 3 of yesterday's presidential primaries in Kentucky, in Oregon, and in Tennessee. Kentucky had been considered a toss-up, and the president won it. Tennessee had been considered Reagan country, and conservative Democrats in Tennessee could cross over to vote for Reagan, but the president squeaked out a 2,000-vote victory in Tennessee. And in the West, the president easily took Oregon. The president wound up some campaigning in California today for that state's primary on June the 8th. At the airport at San Jose, Mr. Ford talked to reporters about yesterday's victories and what he thinks they mean for his candidacy.
Winning in Kentucky and Tennessee is a good indication that we have a lot of support in those kind of states, and I'm convinced that I'm the best national candidate and the one Republican who can win nationally against any Democrat. I'm not a regional candidate, I'm a national candidate, and I know I can win, and I have some reservations about any other Republican candidate being able to win in November.
Ronald Reagan won 3 Republican primaries yesterday, as many as the president did. Reagan won in Arkansas, Idaho, and Nevada, and he got more delegates than Mr. Ford. The president still is ahead of Reagan in total delegates, but yesterday's voting narrowed the gap. Nevertheless, there seemed to be less happiness on the Reagan campaign today than on the Ford campaign. Catherine Mackin reports.
The election results had to be a disappointment to Reagan. Even the White House thought he might win all the primaries but Oregon. Momentum is what Reagan had lots of after he upset President Ford in North Carolina and Texas.
Thank you very much.
But he doesn't have it anymore, so he must win the important California primary. He started campaigning here today with a tough law and order speech at a police officers' convention.
As for the death penalty, I favor it today as I did when I was governor of California. It not only deters crime, it is the ultimate and greatest deterrent because the criminal knows that from the imposition of this sentence, there will be no probation and no parole.
Before yesterday's primaries, Ronald Reagan claimed that he would win a first ballot nomination at this summer's national convention. But after yesterday's primaries, he said simply that the great possibility exists that he will get a first ballot nomination. Some in the Reagan campaign would be happy if Reagan could simply confuse the Ford campaign by denying the president a first ballot nomination. And this they think they can do with the big win here in California. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign.
And by our reckoning, here is the count of Republican delegates so far. President Ford has 779, Ronald Reagan has 637, and there are 153 uncommitted. Also on the program this evening, we'll hear from some of the Democrats who won primaries yesterday. We'll learn more about Elizabeth Ray, who has caused Congressman Wayne Hayes. In yesterday's Democratic primaries, Jimmy Carter won, as expected, in Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But Frank Church beat him in Oregon and in Church's home state of Idaho, while California's Jerry Brown, to no one's surprise, beat Carter in Nevada. Not the best day of the year for Jimmy Carter, but he is still the leader in the race. Today, he picked up the endorsement of the governor of Illinois, Daniel Walker. And in New York City, the man from Plains, Georgia, got another endorsement. Don Oliver reports.
This national program...
Carter moved swiftly to counter any adverse effects of his Oregon loss. He rounded up a new supporter, New York Mayor Abraham Beame. Beame is a delegate pledged to Senator Henry Jackson. But now he says he supports Carter as the one candidate who can bring victory to the Democratic Party. Carter was then off to New Jersey, which has a primary the same day as California. Carter will concentrate his energy here and in Ohio, two states where his main opponents will be Frank Church, Morris Udall, and uncommitted.
So good to see you again.
In New Jersey, Carter has the support of the state's governor, something he does not have from Jerry Brown in California. For a man who doesn't think political endorsements mean much, Carter was making the most of them today, while also denying that his bandwagon had been slowed or detoured.
I think even in spite of the fact that I have a crop of new and fresh and very attractive candidates who are well-financed, who are dividing up their responsibility among different states while I enter them all, I've still done very well.
Carter did win half the primaries yesterday in states where there was no real opposition. He has yet to win, however, in 5 tries against Jerry Brown and Frank Church. Don Oliver, NBC News, Trenton, New Jersey.
And here's where the Democrats stand in delegates by our NBC News calculations. Carter in the lead with 847. Congressman Mo Udall second with 281. Scoop Jackson, no longer an active contender, 240. And George Wallace, 157. There are 393 uncommitted Democratic delegates. Frank Church, the latecomer in the race, has 47 delegates. But he was delighted today about the outcome of the Oregon primary. Bob Jameson is traveling with the Church campaign.
Church tried to call the victory another miracle, but it was the result of nearly 2 weeks of solid campaigning. He was particularly pleased, however, because it was his second straight win over Jimmy Carter.
The politics of substance has won tonight over the politics of style.
Today, Church flew to California to begin his campaign there. The Oregon victory, he says, means his candidacy can no longer be overlooked, and he believes last night's win spells trouble for Jimmy Carter. Church said there was not much significance in the 3 Southern primaries Carter won last night because he had no opposition.
I think the Oregon contest is really the significant one because here he was up against a strong challenge, and I think what we demonstrated in Oregon is that people are taking a second look at Governor Carter in any contest in which he is really challenged.
As Church campaigned at UCLA today, aides were preparing a television appeal for money. After last night's victory, there is no shortage of enthusiasm. But the Church campaign still faces a shortage of cash that may make it difficult to build on the Oregon win. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Los Angeles.
In the Oregon primary yesterday, Jimmy Carter's broad support, his normal broad support, did not materialize. He was flanked on the left by Jerry Brown and on the right by Frank Church. And as we've seen, he lost to Church while beating Brown's attempt for a write-in victory. And in a state known far and wide for its active participation in politics, fewer voters turned out yesterday in Oregon than normally turned out. Here's more on Oregon from John Hart.
It would have been phenomenal anywhere else, but in Oregon it was disappointing, below average, with close to a 60% turnout. Thousands of voters registering on the day they voted, which is allowed here. NBC's poll shows Church winning as a traditional candidate, getting Labor and conservative Democrats running as Oregon's neighbor, and winning the votes of people who were born here.
I like the fact that he comes from this part of the country and he's from a small state, and maybe we need someone like that for a change.
he seems like a person that I could talk to. I mean, he could talk to me and know my problems.
Jerry Brown won his write-in vote by beating Carter on the environment, on anti-Washington sentiment, and among young people.
Him and Church both had good ideas on the environment, but I'm just kind of leaning for Brown, I suppose, just for the novelty that he's a write-in candidate and he's young.
I just look at Jerry Brown, probably in an age group that I'm in, and I can relate to him a lot better than I can Carter.
One of Carter's strengths was electability, and there was some religious appeal, too.
I feel like right now he's the only Democrat that really has a chance to get the nomination and keep Hubert Humphrey from getting it.
I'm a religious person myself, and I sort of felt that maybe he would be the fellow to take us the next 4 years.
But there weren't enough people who felt that way here, Oregon being one of the less religious states. Carter lost conservative Democrats to Church and liberal Democrats to Brown, and showed up behind them on his trust rating.
Jimmy Carter comes across to me more as a polished showman.
I think Jimmy Carter is very wishy-washy.
The Stop Carter people were afraid Brown would stop Church instead. But what happened was, with Brown in the rear and Church in front, they bit off different parts of Carter's usual support. Now, Carter, having lost the first 3 Western primaries and having won by a blink in Michigan, may begin to have trouble selling himself as a broad-based national candidate. John Hart, NBC News, Portland.
Congressman Mo Udall, who has often finished second in contests against Jimmy Carter, was not actively involved in yesterday's primaries. But Udall is running in the Ohio primary 2 weeks from now. Today he told Charles Quinn of our staff that he hopes Frank Church will stay out of the Ohio primary so as not to divide the anti-Carter vote. Quinn asked Udall if this message had been sent to Church, and Udall said he would ask him. I have been wondering if the Humphrey-Kennedy team is made of substantial stuff. But yesterday, when Carter attacked unnamed people for trying to stop him, he made clear that he didn't think that either Kennedy or Humphrey was involved in the Stop Carter movement. The significance of that is not immediately apparent. Carter was campaigning in Ohio today, and he's made a tactical change. Don Oliver has that story.
Yesterday, Jimmy Carter was calling his opponents entrenched, unresponsive, irresponsible, and bankrupt. It was tough language, and there was criticism of it. So today, Carter changed his tactics.
This year may be the first year in our history that it's better to be a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, than a U.S. Senator from Washington.
Instead of calling his opponents names, he suggests they are rich, powerful, influential, and don't suffer with the common man. He suggests he does.
I never claim to be better or wiser than any other person. I think my greatest strength is that I'm an ordinary man, just like you all. One who's worked and who's learned and loved his family and made mistakes and tried to correct them. Sometimes in the heat of political battle, harsh words are spoken and sometimes overstatements are made.
Later, Carter said that last reference to harsh words was aimed at Morris Udall.
I think that the advertising program that Mr. Udall used in Michigan, the one that he's unveiled in Washington, I think yesterday, is designed almost exclusively as a personal attack on me, on my honesty, on my integrity. And I think this is the first instance that I know of that has been a part of the political scene in our country this year. I deplore that very deeply.
Carter said the Udall advertising was vituperative. Udall then denied he has any new anti-Carter TV commercials. Don Oliver, NBC News, Youngstown.
And here's our weekly NBC News tally of how the most active candidates are doing with convention delegates. Jimmy Carter has 853. Mo Udall has 277. Frank Church has 47. Jerry Brown has 25, and there are 390 uncommitted. This weekend, 21 more delegates will be chosen by Democrats in Iowa and Hawaii. And on the Republican side, Gerald Ford has 775, Ronald Reagan has 634, and there are 153 uncommitted delegates to the Republican convention. There are a few more primaries to be held, but the big prizes will come in the last three primaries to be held on June the 8th in California, Ohio, and New Jersey. In those contests, the Democrats will pick 540 delegates, the Republicans 331. Brown and Senator Frank Church. Our nightly news special this evening is the product of several weeks of work by Tom Pettit of our staff. Pettit has been taking a long, close look at the life story of Jimmy Carter. He has prepared two reports on Jimmy Carter's character, and this is the first one.
This will not be an expose. It is an attempt to find out what makes Jimmy run, to piece together the friends and the facts of his private life, which is very, very private. What emerges is a portrait of an uncommonly single-minded man who is determined through his candidacy to restore the South to a respectable role in national politics. Jimmy Carter's roots go deep in the Deep South. Generations ago, some members of the Carter family owned slaves in Georgia. Reminders of the Civil War are everywhere. Not 20 miles from where Carter grew up, the remains of Andersonville Prison, where 13,000 Union Army soldiers died. Jimmy Carter could not escape the Southern legends about honor, pride, guilt, and patriotism. The Naval Academy at Annapolis, where Jimmy Carter graduated in 1946. He had to overcome physical obstacles to get here, like flat feet, which he cured by rolling them on soft drink bottles.
There was a funny thing about that. His feet were too flat, and he had to roll a Coca-Cola bottle for months and months and months. And he was not quite tall enough, and he did everything to stretch himself. He ate bananas to gain a little weight. Isn't that great that you have to eat something? He wasn't strong, he wasn't tall enough, and he wasn't heavy enough. And he really put the weight on, and he got a little bit taller, and he cured his feet. So that's the way he's always done. When he makes up his mind to do anything, he's going to do it.
As a midshipman, Carter missed out on combat in World War II. But as a Southerner, he was subjected to hazing by upperclassmen who wanted him to sing Marching Through Georgia, a Union Army song. But Carter would not betray the South, even though his stubborn refusal to sing brought him paddling, push-ups, and extra turns on the obstacle course. Carter's official Navy records show an unblemished career after Annapolis. He burned with ambition to become Chief of Naval Operations, the highest rank in the Navy. Now he just wants to be Commander-in-Chief. Everything in Carter's background indicates he is a man driven by a lifelong ambition to be somebody, and more than that, to be a Southern somebody. Early in school, he got A's in almost every course. 1941 at Georgia Southwestern College, he got all A's and B's except for a C in geometry. 1942, Georgia Tech, good grades, but for a C in Spanish and a D in math. At the Naval Academy, he ranked high in his class. Carter has enormous drive. Some people who know him well say he is virtually a workaholic. Charles Curbo, his closest friend and political mentor.
He works hard, and he sits down and plans what he's going to do, and he tries to stay with his plan, and he just works at it harder than other people. Of course, he's a very talented fellow.
There's a missionary zeal about Carter.
He just goes in wherever he goes, to black people, white people, Italians, or any other kind. And he has no fear that he won't like them and that they won't like him.
Genuine missionary zeal is a part of Carter's character, an important part. He has done missionary service for the Southern Baptist Church. 1968, he went on a mission to Springfield, Massachusetts to campaign for Christ among Puerto Ricans.
You know, when you knock on the door of a person and tell them who you are, you're a Baptist, Southern Baptist, something like this, people are ready to close the door. But Jimmy Carter, with his smile and with his kind approach, was always able sort of to keep the conversation and to establish a bridge and to continue that conversation.
Later, when he was governor, Carter had a profound religious experience in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, while starting a new church there.
The church later failed. Carter does not like failure.
I never have seen him discourteous or hurt people in reprimanding them or use bad language or anything of that sort. I've seen him fire people, and he doesn't mind firing someone if they don't do the work, if they can't do the job. Well, he calls them in and very gently tells them that they're finished.
Herbo said Carter is both tough and determined. He is seemingly dominated by one goal, getting ahead, and also proving that a Southerner can earn national respectability. Tom Pettit, NBC News in Plains, Georgia.
That's the first of Pettit's reports on Carter. In the second, we'll see what Pettit learned about Carter's teeth. Carter's barber, she's incidentally a former Playboy bunny, and his former TV coach. We hope to bring you that tomorrow evening. Until then, good night.